right, we start. Hi, my talk is called No. Take it down, he screamed. Take it down now. I'd written an article for an online magazine about a charity. It was probably the most arduous article I've ever written, and I've got to write a lot over the years. It was about a charity event. I had to go to multiple meetings, the rehearsal for the show itself. I interviewed multiple people. I think 5 of the organizers out of 6 I interviewed for this article. This one organizer was on holiday. And even though I mentioned them in the article, they weren't satisfied. Take it down now, they screamed. I think they were screaming because it was in a WhatsApp chat group. And I looked at the message, and I looked at the message. But how did I get here anyway? So I was raised in a working class industrial city in the north of England. It's a brutally self-depreciating culture where people struggle to express their emotions. We say things that are very indirect, like, it's not bad. The number of times I've had to explain in Asia what it's not bad means. It's not bad. So what is it? My dad's a good example, the most beautiful, generous, working class northern man you could ever meet, could never express his feelings directly. A good example would be, we'd be having dinner, and he'd be eating his dinner, and I would say, oh, how's the food, Dad? And he would be like, oh, it's not so good. And then the waiter would come over and say, hey guys, how's the food? He would look at the waiter and say, it's amazing, thank you so much. I'd look at my dad like, you just said it was. And this is our culture, high context culture. So we'd say that's not bad, meaning that's good, depending on the tone of voice, and people would hear that's kind of poor. In fact, somebody published this lexicon about how to translate English into English, the British English Translation Guide, what we'd say, what we'd mean, and what people would hear. Things like, that's a very brave proposal. What we really meant was, you are insane. But what people hear would be, he thinks I have courage. Or another example would be, you must come for dinner. Obviously, we don't mean come for dinner, we're just being polite. But what that person would hear would be, I'm going to be invited for dinner very soon. I'd moved to Japan, and I lived in Japan for 4 years. In Japan, they have a similar high context culture, and this concept of kuki wo yomu, like reading the air and taking a hint. In Japan, there's an idea that you say one thing and mean 10 things. Even after 4 years in Japan, I still didn't quite get to grips with this. I'm preparing to leave, and I say to my manager, I asked for something from my manager, something trivial, and he looks at me, Motokashi ne, chotto mate, and he gets on the telephone. Then he sucked in his teeth and thinks, Motokashi ne. And even after 4 years in Japan, I sat in that chair for 1 hour until I realized he was saying no. But he just couldn't say it directly to me. Gert Hofstede did lots of research into cultural dimensions of communication, and he broke it down into 6 dimensions. The first one is power distance, how much we defer to people above us in a hierarchy or a company. He also talked about elements like individualism versus collectivism, masculinity, how a culture conforms to masculine forms, or femininity, restraint versus indulgence, long-term and short-term thinking, long-term being planning ahead and things like short-term being focused on tradition and things like saving face. In extreme cases, cultural communication can be disastrous. The worst air accident of all time happened in Tenerife, March 7, 1977. 583 people lost their life because 2 planes crashed on the runway. Los Rios Airport, now renamed Tenerife North Airport. The conversation between the air engineer and the pilot went like this. Is he not clear? The KLM engineer said, speaking about the Pan American flight that we may be still on the runway. And the pilot said, oh yes, and proceeded to take off with disastrous circumstances. So I have all these ideas in mind about culture and how we're different and how people conform to certain behavior because where they were born and where they live. And then I moved into textbook publishing, and I came to Vietnam to work with the Ministry of Education on a textbook. At the same time, I started traveling around the world, 14 countries. I think I spoke to well over 10,000 people about how we learn. And I got a chance to test things out on people, on a real life audience. A good example is like an auditorium today. I would speak to 200 people, 300 people. People would always prefer to sit at the back. Everywhere I went, 14 countries, Bangladesh, China, Japan, they would always prefer to sit at the back. And it was always the same. The MC would introduce me a bit like today. Hey guys, welcome our speaker for today. Give David a big round of applause. Before we begin, could you all move forward, please? Could you move forward? And what would happen? Nothing happened. 14 countries, the same thing, nothing happened. The next week I'd go to a different country, the same thing. Hey everybody, welcome our speaker for today, David. Give him a big round of applause. Before we begin, did you all move forward? And what happened? Nobody moved forward. And I got to thinking, that's crazy, isn't it? We keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So one time, I think it was in Jakarta, I thought I'm going to try a different approach. So I took the mic from the MC and I said, hey guys, I've got a warm-up for you. And everyone was like, oh, I love a warm-up. Do this. First, can you stand up? And I waited, and 100 people, or later 200 people, 300 people stood up. And I waited till they all stood up. I said, okay, next, can you gather your belongings and put them in your hands? That's a very strange warm-up, but they did it, and I waited till everyone did it. They'd hold their bag or their laptop or their notebook. When everyone had done it, I would say, now move forward. And 100 people, 100% of people, whether it was 100 people, 200 people, or 300 people, would move forward, regardless of culture or shyness. And I thought that's interesting, isn't it? And then I did another test. We can try it. Let's try it today, shall we? So this test goes like this. I'm going to give you 10 words and 10 seconds to remember the words. Okay? Then I'm going to remove the words and see how many you can remember. So are you ready? 10 seconds starts now. Okay, that's my very short 10 seconds. How many can you remember? Just give you a second to try and tell your neighbor or recall how many you can. Generally, it's around 3 or 4. I found, I did it with multiple audiences across the world. It's about 3 or 4. Then I'd do this. I'd say, I'm nice. I'm going to give you a second chance. So I'm going to give you guys a second chance too. I'm going to give you 10 more words for 10 more seconds and see how many you can remember. This time you can work with the person next to you. You can work with your neighbor. Okay, 10 seconds starts now. Let's see how many you can remember. Okay, these are the answers. How did you do? Everybody does better the second time, right? Sometimes we get 10 out of 10 if you have a notebook and you have the right partner. Usually it's 7 or 8. But something weirder about this happened. So I did this test in multiple countries, and the same thing happened in every single country. I would say, I'm nice, I'm going to give you a second chance. Here's 10 new words and 10 more seconds. This time you can work with your neighbor or partner. Everywhere around the world, the audience thought they were so smart. They would say to their friend, I'll remember 1 to 5. You remember 6 to 10. We're going to nail this. Everywhere I went, except 2 guys in Thailand. I was in Bangkok doing a talk, and they were sat at the front, and I heard them, and one of them said, I've got 1 to 5. And his friend said, oh, I've got 1 to 5 as well. But that's funny, isn't it? That human beings respond to the same prompt to move forward if it's delivered correctly. And also, they want to collaborate and win a completely meaningless test. Every single culture and country, from China to Sri Lanka to India, that I've ever been to. So I started thinking maybe all this cultural baggage is not something we should focus on. We should focus on something that's more human. So I arrived in Vietnam as a textbook writer and a speaker, and my friend had an online magazine, a culture magazine. And you know, those kind of friends who keep nagging you, please write for me, please write for me. And I didn't want to work with her, and I didn't want to write, and I couldn't write. I tried writing all my life. I used to buy a really expensive moleskin notebook, and I would get it out, maybe on a train or on a journey, and try and write something. And every time it was terrible. I just couldn't write. Sometimes I'd open a Word document on my laptop. Everything I wrote was bad, but I could edit, and she knew it. So she eventually persuaded me after a year. Please write for me, she said. Finally, I said yes, and I wanted to do a restaurant review. So I went to a restaurant, it's closed now, it's called Duraku, opened by the Aoki brothers next to the Norfolk Hotel in Saigon. And I walked around, I spoke to the staff, and I tried the food. And instead of writing anything down, I got on my motorbike and I drove around. And as I was driving around, I got a sentence in my head. It wasn't very good. And so I kept driving and played around with it until it sounded good. Oh, it sounds really good, that sentence. I'm going to do another one. I kept driving and thought about another one. It wasn't very good. And I switched it around a little bit and it sounded good. And then I thought, I'll do one more. And so I kept driving and driving. And I did a third one, drove home quickly, ran upstairs, typed down the 3 sentences as they were in my head, and then filled in the gaps in between. And I sent my editor friend the draft. She published it the next day without an edit. And she's like, did you do that? And I'm like, yeah. She's like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, I couldn't write yesterday. And today I can write just because of my Honda Cub and how I approach the act of writing. So I went on to write for an edit and be editor-in-chief for 3 magazines now. That was Any Arena back in the day, then Be Etc. And now I have my own magazine that's part of our wonderful Wink Hotels project called the Dot Magazine. Along the way, obviously, I've got to meet actors and chefs and creatives and marketing people, and I got to have the weirdest, most wonderful relationships and get in the strangest situations. I got in these weird situations, and as I started off today, I'd get in these situations where people were asking me aggressively to do things. How should I say no? Take it down, David, take it down. How should I take no? If you Google how to say no, there's lots of bad advice online. For example, 6 ways to say no. Switch out no for later. Don't switch out no for later. Rehearse your no's. A bad no doesn't need rehearsing. Learn how to say a naked no. And on and on. If you Google how to say no, it looks like this. So I looked at my phone and the WhatsApp group, and I thought about growing up in England, how we would indirectly say no. And then I thought about the plane accident in Tenerife and high context cultures and power distances. And I looked at the phone and I looked at the phone and I just said, no. And that guy never replied. And he never bothered me ever again. And since that day, I've employed no many times. Not aggressively, not angrily, with a warm look on your face. Naked no is the end of the conversation. And this is the end of my TED Talk today. Thank you very much.